We are April 9th, 2004, a couple of days after Pesach, and we all got together for a Seder, a reunion of family, and we're resuming the chronicling of Joan Bornstein's life. And so we're going to pick up sort of where we left off, but not exactly. At any rate, sort of the transition from teenage to adulthood. And we'll start by asking, what was your high school experience like?
Well, I went to a school that had a very good rating, James Madison High School. I didn't have any academic difficulties. It was rather comfortable for me. Socially, I dated a lot. It was not exactly the most exciting time of my life.
Could you walk to school?
I could walk to school. Even in the snow, we walked to school. A group of us walked together. We kind of picked up people as we went, and we walked. It was a nice big walk, but it was comfortable. And it was fun.
Were there any kids in your building that you walked to school with?
Not in my building. There was one person who lives in the next building. And then it seemed that we just picked up people as we went along. Other people came along with us. As I say, it wasn't an eventful, exciting. It was a normal high school time.
Now the context in terms of what was going on historically while you were in high school.
Well, prior to that time was the end of, I was 15 when the war ended. By that time I was also going to camp, and that was an exciting part of my life. In fact, the day that the war with Japan was over, I was in camp, and that was the period of time that...
So in 1945, you were 15.
I was 15. Yes. We got to be seniors in high school, many of us had to make decisions where we're going to go to school, and I knew that I was somewhat limited in terms of financial where I could go. But at that time, the boys were coming back from the war, and it was very, very difficult to get into the city schools. You had to take an exam, and you had to have a certain average, but most of it depended upon the exam. And I was very fortunate. I did well in the exam, and you had to be in the top 3% of the people taking the exam. And I got into Brooklyn College, and I decided that even though I was accepted to a few other schools, I preferred to stay at Brooklyn. I thought I would get a good education.
Did you apply to any other schools?
I applied to other schools. I was accepted at Miami, in Ohio, and a few other places.
Why would you even think of applying to Miami of Ohio?
It was recommended to me, and that's where I applied. A friend of my mother's daughter went there, and she loved it, and so I applied there.
And what about your friend, University of Maryland? Was that on the list?
No.
No.
No, it wasn't. It didn't have a very good reputation at that time. It wasn't a highly academic school, and I, at that point, wanted to be pre-med, and I started out with that in mind. Of course, there were basic courses that I had to take. As soon as I entered college, I had good friends who were in there with me, and we decided we weren't going out for sorority. We were not sorority girls. But they had groups that we could join. They were called houses, and we belonged to one Dalton house. And then I wasn't very happy about getting into the boosters, which was essentially the cheerleading squad. Although in those years they didn't let us actually cheerlead, we did marching on the field and formed various letters and designs and what have you. And because I'm short, I was usually the leader of one of the lines, so I really had a good time. And that brought me close contact with the football players, which was also a lot of fun because
Were there any Jewish football players?
Yes, there were Jewish football players at Brooklyn College, many of them. And
now, did you have any issues with who you dated and who you didn't date with respect to religion? Or
I happened to date Jewish boys all the time. That was it.
Mhm.
I dated Jewish boys. I was active in my temple during high school, and not so much in college. But while
and what kind of a temple was it that you grew up in?
it was a reform temple, but it was more of a traditional nature. The men wore kippot, and the catering people were kosher, and they observed 2 days of Rosh Hashanah. So it was more of a tradition. And the rabbi was
What was the name of it?
Ahavat Sholom. And the Rabbi Alan Steinbach, was a very literary man. He wrote many books of poetry, and he consecrated me when I was 4. We didn't have bat mitzvahs at that time. So I was confirmed at the age of 15, and it was a wonderful relationship. They had wonderful youth groups, and we all went, and we had parties in people's homes, and it was that was all part of my high school years. When I went into college, as I said, I was pre-med, but after 1 year I decided that really wasn't something I would want to give my entire life to.
And why is that?
Well, I think at that time my friends were all thinking as soon as they graduated from college they were going to get married, and that was going to be a very long period of time to go to college, medical school, internship, residency, and I decided that the pull wasn't strong enough.
Mm-hmm.
But at that point, I was teaching at Sunday school, and I felt being a rabbi would be something I would love to do, and I went to see my rabbi.
So wait a minute, let me step back a second. So how did you do your first year of college?
How did I do? Terribly.
Yeah. Why do you think you did terribly?
Because I was too engaged socially.
You mean being a cheerleader?
And all
that was a
the,
freshman cheerleader.
And the house plan and friendships and so on. And I had sailed through high school. I had done very well in high school. And suddenly I was there in a college where everybody was very bright and very diligent in their working in school. And I thought I could just sail by, so I did not do well at all.
Was that a shock to you?
It was tremendous shock. I think I failed one class and and got a D in another. And after that, I was totally different.
And did that, you think, the fact of the difficulty or the lack of success that you had in your first semester or your first year, did that affect your ambition to be a doctor?
Perhaps. Although that was the only class that was one of the classes I got an A in biology. But so I went to see the rabbi, and I said I would really like to be a rabbi, and he laughed and said there'll never be a woman rabbi. This is a profession for men. However, Hebrew Union College is beginning a program for people who are interested in going into religious education and to become eventually a director of a day school or a religious school.
What did your father and mother think about your ambition to be a rabbi?
Well, they knew that I couldn't do it. They knew that.
Did your father say anything about it at all?
No, he was pleased. He liked the idea that I was interested and wanted to know more about Judaism.
Did he also sort of steer you in a direction that was, in effect, consistent with the times and consistent with expectations for women?
I think my father was very accepting of my choices in life. He told me to give good thought to it, and when I did, he usually accepted what I chose. I did follow the rabbi's suggestion, and I went to Hebrew Union College, and I enrolled, and I went to Brooklyn College during the day, and Tuesday and Thursday night I went to HUC. Monday night I taught swimming to the blind. So I had a very full schedule, and that's the way I liked it.
Now, did you have any sort of Zionistic or relationship toward Israel that was also associated with this? Because after all, 1948, creation of the state, you were 18. That's when you entered college.
The state of Israel was very important in our lives. I mean, very important. And
do you have any reminiscence of what it was like in terms of the formation of the state of Israel?
I knew. Of course, we discussed it in our home and in the family. My family was very Zionistic, so we spoke about it a great deal. We also had rescued my father had seen to it that Highest rescued a family, a husband and a wife from Europe, and got them to Israel, and then we supported them while they were in Israel. A great deal, and then many years later we visited them. In fact, we all got to meet them. Shall I go back to college a little bit?
Sure. Do you have a story to tell?
Well, I think that I went, as I said, I went to HUC, and I went Tuesday and Thursday night, and I was in classes with all of the rabbis and cantors, because there were very few women at that time in the school. But towards the end of my years there, I met your dad, and
were there any other men that you met or dated at that time?
No, I had a friend who used to come to the house, and I'd accompany him on the piano while he was studying, but it wasn't a dating thing. I was just friendly with him. Most of the men were married and had children, especially the cantors. They were almost all married and had children. But we traveled together home on the subway. We would all get on the subway and go to Brooklyn from New York. And one of them would insist upon walking me to where I would meet my father, so I wasn't walking late at night all by myself.
So let's see, let me just understand. You were going by day to Brooklyn College?
Yes.
And at night to HUC?
Yes.
Why were you so, that's a pretty busy schedule.
Yes.
So what else is new?
What?
So what else is new?
That's my life. I like to be involved in things, always like to be involved in things.
Were you thinking about was there a social element that also connected you to it?
Remember, I was 18, 19, and 20, well, 19, 20, and 21 when I went to HUC. And I was very interested in all the rabbis and cantors.
Yeah, so you were hoping to meet and marry one then, I imagine.
I don't think at first I was. At first I was. But of course, I wanted that kind of life.
Yeah.
Associated with synagogues. The men that I traveled home with really were interested in making a shidduch with your dad. In fact, when we'd all go on the subway, they would all rush for seats and leave 2 seats empty or leave the seat next to your father empty, and I would have to sit there.
Because he was one of the few single ones.
Right,
I
absolutely. Joe Portnoy had 3 children. Many of them had quite a few children, or were married at least, and yeah. So I didn't do too well in Hebrew. And then in last year I was there, Hebrew was two classes, There was a bell in between, and you could go out for a little bit, and the classes all changed. And the minute the bell would ring, it wouldn't matter what was going on, I would jump up and leave the classroom. And one day the rabbi said to me in Hebrew, Yocheved, which is my Hebrew name, Yocheved, if you paid more attention to the Ivrit and less attention to the Chazanim and Rabbanim, you would be a better student. And I laughed, and of course I tried. I mean, I was not an impossible student. I wasn't failing, but at the end of that year, I became engaged to your dad.
And which year was this?
That was May '52.
And so that was your, what, second year?
My third year.
Third year?
Yeah.
And in the meantime, you were continuing at Brooklyn College?
Right, and I graduated I started HUC when I was in my sophomore year of college, and I finished them both at the same time.
And what did you get a degree in at HUC?
In religious education.
And was it a bachelor's? What did they consider
No,
it?
it was
A certificate?
A certificate.
And at Brooklyn College, it was a bachelor's of arts.
A bachelor of arts in early childhood.
Oh.
To go back to Rabbi Ofer, who at the end of when I got my ring from your dad, I went over to the rabbi, the teacher of the Hebrew, and I said, "You see, if I had studied more Hebrew, I wouldn't have become a chazanah." And of course, he laughed.
So you met. When did you meet?
We met probably, I believe, my second year that I was
And
there.
how did you meet?
In the hall.
Just
Talking with everybody,
just
right.
the social
everybody
scene.
Talking.
Right. And he asked you out, or was it just
Yeah,
sort of
he asked me out, and then we were seeing each other quite regularly when he decided that was it, no more. I was seeing other people as well. I was dating quite a bit. But suddenly he stopped asking me out, and he was very worried because there was a little more than 10-year difference between our ages, and he was a little concerned that that was too big an age difference, and that he was ready to settle down, and I still had a lot of wild oats to sow. But then, sure enough, he was back again, and I guess we pretty much knew that this was it. I was seeing.
Were you reluctant, or were you an eager?
Well, I was seeing other people. Your dad went up to Kingston every Friday and Saturday, and so I dated other men on Saturday night.
Why did he go to Kingston?
He was an intern, and he was the Cantor
I
Royal
see.
student, and that was his student.
So he
pulpit.
would vacate you on the weekend.
Right. And
So you were fair game.
Sure, absolutely. And I would go out and went with a young man by the name of Jerry quite a bit. And when
Also a student at HUC?
No. Just someone I met at my friend's wedding.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, when your dad asked me to marry him,
So how long had you courted by the time he asked you to marry him?
Well, we knew each other for 2 years, and I guess I was seeing him regularly for I guess about 8-9 months. But it was always on Sunday. I would meet him at the bus terminal, and we'd spend Sunday and Sunday evening together, and then see each other at school on Tuesday and Thursday.
And when did you first meet his parents and his family?
I don't remember exactly when it was. I remember going out there. I remember.
What was your impression of meeting them? Of meeting his mother?
Well, the first thing was a surprise was that his niece. I was just graduating from college, and his niece was just starting college, and I was
This was Susan?
This was Susan, and I had more in common with her than I did with your dad's sisters and brother, because he was the baby of the family,
Yeah.
and he was 10 years older, whereas between Susan and I, there was like something like 4 years difference. I liked them. I liked Phil and his wife and Such, and I didn't get to know them. Big Aunt Esther lived with them, and she was a really neat lady. I mean, she had never married, and she was a little bitter, but she was a good-hearted person, especially to me.
How did his mother treat you?
I don't think anybody could have been good enough for her son, her
Really?
baby, right?
So that was very clear to you,
Oh, yes.
that she was a protective mom.
Yes. She called him Mine Jake. There are lots of stories I could tell about that.
So what was your impression of this immigrant woman who had obviously an old world Yiddish accent and so on. What was your impression?
That's exactly what I knew she was, an immigrant woman who had old-fashioned ways and was not, you know, I related to her as I related to my grandmother when I was a child. I called her Grandma Mary. I mean, that's the feeling I had about her, that she was a grandma, not somebody I could relate to as I now hope my daughters-in-law relate to me. It's a much different world. And since Jack was the youngest, she was considerably older, although she seemed much older than she actually was. I think she was 71 when we got married, and I remember...
And you're 73 now,
yeah,
as we speak.
Very different.
Yeah.
Very different time. My mother was probably the same age or a little bit younger than she. She was younger, yes. Yes, oh no, she was much younger. But even when my mother was 73, she was vibrant and not anything old world about her. But she was born in the United States and educated in the United States, so it was different. Let's see.
So anyway, so you were dating for 2 years.
Yes.
And then finally...
He asked me to marry him, and...
He gave you a ring.
No, first he asked me to marry him, and I wasn't sure. And I remember telling my mother I was meeting, he gave me an ultimatum. I had to meet him on, I don't remember what night it was, it was one night we weren't in school. I guess it was a Wednesday night. And my mom, or maybe it was after swimming, I don't remember exactly.
After swimming?
Because I taught swimming.
Uh-huh.
And,
what, at a Y, or where did you teach swimming?
I taught swimming, I don't remember exactly where it was, but I taught blind students.
Really?
Yeah. And on Saturdays, I worked with blind children and taught teenagers to do dancing, social dancing. And with the little ones, I just played with. That was my first interest in special education. Anyway, as I left, my mother said to me, "What are you going to say?" And I said, "I don't know." And she said, "Well, if you don't know, you're not going to say yes." And when I was with your dad,
Now, what was your hesitancy?
I didn't know that I was ready for marriage and ready for moving away and that. I remember while we were in April, well, just before April, Dad began to go out to various congregations all over the country.
And this would have been the April before, I suppose, the traditional June graduation?
Right.
Yeah.
And he had to go out and audition for the position of a cantor in these congregations. And he graduated top in his class. And every place he went, they wanted him. And so he had a choice between, I forget all of them, but one of them was Dayton, Ohio, and the other was Miami. And he said to me, "Where do you think I ought to go?" And I said, "Well, who would ever visit you in Dayton? You should go out to Miami. People would visit you there." That was my theory. Never mind what kind of a congregation it was or anything. Anyway, when we met, I said yes. I knew that that's what I wanted.
So let me rewind a little bit. What did your parents think of Jack?
Oh, they liked him very much. My father was very fond of him. They had a wonderful relationship.
But I mean, in advance of your marriage, as you were dating him, as
well,
he
they
was
were
courting
worried
you.
that he was too old and that I was not ready for, to make a commitment to somebody who had. But they liked him. They just were concerned
And were they
about me.
what about the profession that he was in, being a cantor?
Oh, they loved that. My
did.
father especially was absolutely thrilled with that. I remember my aunt, Ada, who was a matriarch of the family. She was horrified that I was going to marry a cantor. She lived in a small town, and being a cantor and a rabbi in a small town is very different.
This is Westwood, New Jersey.
Westwood, New Jersey.
Yeah.
It's now a thriving big city, but it wasn't at the time. And she told me it was a big mistake. Told my parents it was a big mistake. That if I dressed well, they would say the cantor's making too much money. If I dressed didn't dress well, they would say I was a schlump. If they would look in my pots to make sure I was keeping a kosher home. I didn't dare tell her I was going to a Reform temple.
Yeah.
So that was
one comment. That was one opinion.
Yeah.
So finally, you said okay.
Yes, and then.
And so that was in April.
Before that,
Mm-hmm.
Dad had this student congregation in Kingston, as he was a student in Kingston, New York, and he took me up to meet that rabbi and the rabbi's wife, and I knew I was on display. I just knew that he figured if they liked me, I would be okay as a cantor's wife. And of course, I got along very well with them, and they were lovely people. They had a son who was just about my age, and so that was different. So then we got married.
And so.
Before we got married, he also took me in July to Atlantic City because Rabbi Narrett, who was the rabbi of the congregation of Temple Israel, where he was going to go, was vacationing in Atlantic City, and Jack wanted to meet Jack and talk to him before, and Jack insisted that I go as well. And I always had the feeling that if Rabbi Narrett hadn't liked me, he wouldn't have married me. So
that was in 1951 or 1950?
It was in 52.
52.
And in the summer. And,
yeah, 52, right.
And I think I won the rabbi over because he had a 5-year-old child, and he always put his child to bed and told the child stories. And he was talking to Jack, and I said, well, I'll do it. And I went upstairs with her and told her stories and sat with her, and I think that made Rabbi Narrett.
Is this the daughter that was killed in a car accident?
Yes.
Yeah.
Rusi.
Yeah.
He had a son too. Yeah. And then we got married.
So then you accepted in April. Is that the date that you said?
I actually got my ring in May.
In May. Birthday. And then you got married August 3rd.
Right.
So you really only had about 2 months.
Yes.
To plan a wedding.
And I went to camp one of those months.
So who planned the wedding?
My mother. Well, I gave her the instructions. I knew what I wanted. And I mean, I had ridiculous ideas at the time, but that's what my mother did. And it was a lovely wedding.
And in what synagogue? It was in
Ahavah Shalom.
The one that you grew up in.
Right.
Yeah.
So the rabbi consecrated me, confirmed me,
and married
me. Was the rabbi at the funeral for my father.
Right.
Yeah. And then we traveled. Our honeymoon was a trip to Miami in a car that broke down halfway, with all our worldly possessions in the car.
Now, what about, was this a car that you bought specifically for this trip, or was this a car that Jack had?
No, Jack didn't have a car. He bought a car. My father believed wholeheartedly you never buy a used car. It doesn't matter what they say, you don't buy a used car. But his brother swore by this mechanic. And if this mechanic said the car was good, the car was good. Well, the time we got to just north of Florida in Georgia, the car was making a terrible sound and it was awful, and we pulled in and they said, oh, we can't do anything for you, we're not a full service. Drive to Lake City. And when we drove into the Dodge, they said, oh, we know what's wrong with it. Well, it turned out that the oil had never been changed. In all the years the car it was an old, about a couple of years old. And so we stayed in Lake City in a new motel, and there was a Southern couple there with a little boy, and they drove us around and showed us the community and taught us about eating raw peanuts and lots of other nice things.
This is Lake City,
Florida.
Florida, which is where?
It's on the northern border.
So across from Georgia.
Right.
I see. So very southern.
Very southern.
And had you ever been that south before?
No, the farthest south I ever went was Maryland.
Maryland, yeah.
And the farthest west I ever went was Kentucky.
Mhm.
So it was all very new to me. And then we came to Miami, and we stayed at a hotel that was a brand new hotel, and we stayed there and we looked for a place to live. And there was a couple down here who had graduated in the first class a year before as a cantor, and he was the cantor at Temple Judea, and his wife, they had 2 children. She was pregnant with a third, and they were wonderful to us, and they gave us advice as to where we would live.
Whom?
Zeif?
Not
no,
Zeif,
no. It was Cantor Zeif and Abe and Edie were friends we made down here.
Yeah, okay.
But the other couple were cantors of Temple. And she took me to buy pots, and she really was a big help for me. And as I said, I went from being a Sheila in Brooklyn College to being a cantor's wife at a huge Reform temple.
Now, in those days, it was huge.
Oh, yeah. Well, it was not. It was about 550 families, but after Dad came, it kept growing and growing and growing until we finally had 1,800 families and 1,000 children in the religious school. We had to have a Saturday session and a Sunday session. And I had to, it was
So
different.
talk about your participation in that.
Well, to begin with, everybody went to Temple with me. All the cantors in town, they had a big party for us when we came to town.
Who's they?
The cantors, one of the cantors, Shmila Kellemer at Beth Shalom. And we met everybody, and that was wonderful because that was a group that we could relate to. And the first Friday night that Dad was on the pulpit, all the ones who were not Orthodox came to services with me, so I would have, a support group. And one of the women, and I was wearing, it was a time when everyone wore hats, but I was wearing a veil with flowers in the back. And one of the women said to one of the cantor's wives, if your friend wants to be accepted here, she better wear a hat. It was later I found out she was in the millinery business. Funny little things happened. They had a reception for us, and I met hundreds of people. And then came the High Holy Days, and someone said, do you remember me? And I would say, oh yes, I met you at, and it was the other way around. The High Holy Days came first, and I was introduced to many, many people. And then at the reception, they said, do you remember me? And I said, yes, I met you at the, what's my name? And I said, well, if you and I both come every Friday, I'll get to know your name. So I had a little bit of chutzpah, too.
Good for you.
But I was still young. And on Hanukkah, they had a big party we had a big youth group. And we had a party, and I loved to dance. And I was dancing with a few of the kids from the youth group who were like 4 and 5 years younger than I was. And your dad had to say, no, 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 you can't do that anymore. So that was, but being at Temple was nice. It was a good relationship with many, and there was a group called the Couples Limited, and that was for all young couples, and we had many activities. We met once a month. We went on hay rides, and
who were some of the couples that were on this?
The people, the Schillingers. We're still very, very close friends with the Schillingers, the Werners, the Dreyfuses, and the Eisenfelds.
Were you effectively a chavurah?
Yes, exactly. That's what we would have been called today. But we called it Couples Limited. And some of the people who were in Couples Limited went on to be the president of the temple and very, very active and affluent members of the community. Marty Fine and just many, many people. Muriel Rosen, her husband Arnold, was a tremendous philanthropist, big builder, Lennar Homes, and just a wonderful, warm, loving man. Bert Kahn, all of these people were part of this group. I enjoyed going to temple. I was very proud of your father. As they say, kveld when he sang. The services were very, very traditionally reformed.
How did that strike you? I mean, you grew up in a reform, but you said it was sort of more traditional. Was it similar, or was it different?
Oh, it was much different.
Uh-huh.
The cantorial music that was done was similar. But Dad was much more learned in the synagogue music than the cantor that I grew up under. He was a part-time cantor. He had a beautiful voice, and so he was the cantor, but that was not his full profession. I don't know what he did.
So this is the beginning of your life at Temple Israel, and aside from attending Friday night services, when did you first start teaching in the religious school?
Oh, right away.
Right away.
Right away, because I had been trained, and I wasn't going to take a job in another synagogue, so I went to work right away, and I started out as a kindergarten. But I have to tell you a little funny story about going on our honeymoon. When we left, remember, we left with everything we owned was in the car, and we got to the hotel that we were staying at overnight before we took this trip, and Dad went with the man who parked the car to make sure that he locked it, because that everything wouldn't be gone when we awakened. And I was riding up in the elevator with my wedding shoes in my hand and the big corsage on and someone said, "Did you just get married?" And I said, "Yes." And all I could think of is, I went home now. It might be okay. But I didn't go home.
Right.
And the trip down was, as I said, very nice until we had the car trouble. And then, of course, we came down and we stayed at the Saxony.
Here, Jakey, let me just date this with Jakey Bornstein here, who is 7 years old, and we're interviewing his mama. And
if you don't get the sport and turn, you won't get chicken noodle soup.
okay.
So we rented an apartment in a duplex in the Shenandoah southwest section of Miami.
I don't know where that is. Shenandoah?
Yeah, it was called Shenandoah. It was just a section in the southwest part of the southwest 19th Terrace.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a family here, the Singers, who were related to my uncle, David Goldberg, and they took us in as if we were directly related to them, not just by way of, and they were wonderful to us. And he was the president of the temple, so it really was wonderful. And
he was also the founder of Royal Castle, wasn't he?
Absolutely right.
He was an entrepreneur.
Yes.
He must have had
very
other businesses
successful.
besides that.
No, that was it.
That was it?
He had something else before he moved to Miami, but when he moved to Miami, he decided to open a hamburger stand, and then it grew to many, many
I
others.
see, so he grew the business.
Oh, he grew it. And in fact, he put his 2 girls in sandwich signs, and they paraded up and down advertising it. It was really
And then he
nice.
took it public, I suppose, and
And then it was sold to Minnie, what was the singer, Minnie K, country singer, and she had a chicken
oh, right, yeah.
stores, and they sold it. But I still see, of course he passed away, but I still see people in his family, and whenever Larry Singer sees me, he says, "Hi, cuz," so it's nice. Well,
So, okay, so now you're teaching, and I imagine at some point you became pregnant.
Yes, when I first came down, I got a job teaching not only religious school, but I got a job teaching at the JCC. I was teaching nursery school. I started in about September, and by I became pregnant, and